In 1965, South Korea sends its most decorated division to fight a war on the other side of Asia. Backed by American money and American weapons, the men of the Capital Division arrive in Vietnam expecting to prove that Korea has come of age as a military power. Instead, in the villages and foothills of Binh Timah province, they build a reputation so fearsome that the enemy learns to move differently when they are near, and they leave behind a record that Korea will spend the next 30 years refusing to face. In the autumn of 1965, roughly 18,000 Korean troops began arriving in South Vietnam, the first combat contingent of what would become a force of nearly 45,000. At its core was the Capital Division, which the Americans quickly nicknamed the Tigers. Seoul hoped these troops would demonstrate that South Korea was no longer wholly dependent on the United States for its defense. Still, the reasons for sending them were as much economic and political as they were military. To understand why South Korea committed its best soldiers to Vietnam, it helps to remember where the country stood. The Korean War had ended barely a decade earlier, and the wounds were fresh. South Korea was poor, politically fragile, and living under the constant threat of the North. President Park Chung-hee, a former general who had seized power in a 1961 coup, saw the American request for Allied troops not as a burden but as an opportunity. The calculation was threefold. Sending divisions to Vietnam would bring American payments and contracts into the Korean economy on a scale nothing else could match. It would deepen the security guarantee from Washington at a moment when the North remained a live threat. And it would let a nation that had spent a decade as a junior partner show that it could stand as a military power in its own right. There was also conviction. The Korean Officer Corps had fought communist forces on their own soil, and their anti-communism was not an abstraction imported from American policy. It was personal, and it was intense. This distinction from the American approach to the war would matter enormously once the fighting began. South Korea was not new to Vietnam in 1965. Seoul had offered troops as early as 1954, an offer Washington declined at the time. A non-combat engineering and medical force of more than 2,400 men, nicknamed the Dove Unit, reached Bien Hoa in February 1965 to build bridges, schools, and clinics. The Dove Unit operated under rules of engagement so restrictive its men could only return fire and had to call on the South Vietnamese army if seriously attacked. The contrast with what followed could hardly be sharper. Within a year, Korea would send not medics under a leash, but a full combat division with the freedom to fight as it chose. When the decision came, Park insisted on one condition that shaped the entire character of the force. Only volunteers would be sent. This was not sentiment. Korean soldiers volunteered in vast numbers, drawn by pay that dwarfed anything available at home, and by the promise of 3 years of service credit for each year in Vietnam. Because so many stepped forward, commanders could handpick who went with them. The men who deployed were, quite literally, the ones their officers wanted most. On the 19th of August 1965, the Korean National Assembly passed the bill authorizing the dispatch. The division chosen was no accident. The Capital Division held one of the longest and most decorated records in the Korean Army, forged in the fighting of 1950 to 1953 when it had battled up the East Coast and earned the Tiger name. Korean historians selected the Vietnam contingents on the basis of heritage, mission, and combat lineage, and by those measures the Capital Division was close to ideal. The division was commanded by Major General Chae Myung, who would come to embody the force he led. 39 years old, a holder of 14 Korean military decorations, Chae had shaped much of the Korean approach to the war, and he would later rise to command all Korean forces in Vietnam from a corps headquarters at Nha Trang. He was a commander who believed reputation itself was a weapon. The deployment unfolded in 3 increments across the autumn of 1965, the first units landing on the 29th of September. By November, the bulk of the division had established itself about 6 miles west of Quy Nhon in Binh Dinh province. The location was chosen with care. It was sparsely populated, which meant the Koreans would not displace farmers from valuable land, and it sat astride the 2 arteries that mattered most in the central region. Those arteries were Highway 1, the coastal spine running north to south, and Highway 19, which climbed inland through the An Khe Pass toward the Central Highlands. Whoever held these roads controlled the movement of men, rice, and supplies across a vital slice of the country. The 1st Brigade of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division had held the Quai Non area beforehand and handed over responsibility through October 1965. The Tigers inherited a province that was, in large stretches, a Viet Cong stronghold. The Koreans brought to this task an institutional peculiarity that set them apart from the Americans from the start. They refused to place themselves under American operational control. This was partly national pride. After years of American tutelage on how to build and lead a modern army, Vietnam was the chance to prove Koreans could operate independently, without American officers looking over their shoulders. The practical effect was significant. Korean commanders planned their own operations, set their own rules of engagement, and answered ultimately to Seoul, rather than to the American command at Military Assistance Command Vietnam. At the time, this simply meant the Tigers fought their own war, their own way. When their conduct later came into question, the same autonomy would make accountability far harder to establish. Their way began with training that bordered on the fanatical. Every soldier practiced Taekwondo, with 30 minutes of martial arts folded into morning physical training as routine. At the division headquarters in Quy Non, visitors were startled to find white uniforms and black belts in the middle of a combat zone. American journalists seized on the detail, and it became central to the myth of the Tigers. The reality behind the myth was more mundane and more effective. The training built cohesion, discipline, and a willingness to close with an enemy that most conscript armies preferred to fight at a distance. Discipline within the ranks was severe to the point of brutality. When 2 Korean soldiers raped a Vietnamese woman early in the deployment, they were executed in front of their assembled company. The message was unambiguous. Given what the division would later be accused of on a mass scale, it is an irony the historical record does not resolve neatly. Harsh internal discipline and allegations of atrocity against civilians were features of the same force. The tactical method that made the Tigers feared rested on a single principle. The Koreans did not chase the enemy, they trapped him. Their signature operation sealed off a relatively small area, usually no more than 9 or 10 square kilometers, then brought in troops by both air and land, so every element arrived at once. The point was to close the chokehold before anyone inside could slip out. Once contact was made, the encirclement tightened with a patience American units rarely matched. Where U.S. commanders, under pressure to produce a body count and rotate home, preferred to fix an enemy and destroy him quickly with overwhelming firepower, the Koreans preferred to fix him and wait. They deployed multiple companies in a ring, fought through the daylight hours, and held the cordon through the night to prevent escape under cover of darkness. Day by day, the circle shrank. It was slow, methodical, and difficult to escape. The environment shaped the doctrine. In a war without a front, where the enemy was a farmer by day and a fighter by night, the encircle and tighten method was a direct answer to the central problem of counterinsurgency. The Koreans could not always tell fighter from farmer, so their solution was to seal an area completely and let the cordon sort the question out over days. This was tactically shrewd. It also placed enormous discretionary power in the hands of soldiers making life and death judgments about who inside the ring was an enemy. The Tigers earned a reputation as uncanny searchers, able to find weapons caches and hidden fighters others walked past. They planned meticulously and sometimes rehearsed operations beforehand. A well-documented episode from July 1966 captures the mindset. A Korean lieutenant looked into a peasant cottage and noticed at once what a Western soldier might have missed. A woman and 2 children were eating their evening meal, but there was far too much rice on the table for 3 people. He concluded company was expected, detained the villagers, and set an ambush. 2 hours later, 3 Viet Cong arrived for dinner and were killed. That single incident was one of some 8,400 ambushes the Tigers laid in their first 8 months in country. The figure captures the tempo of a division that treated the night as its own and turned the ambush into an industrial process. This was not a force that fought a handful of set-piece battles. It saturated its territory with hundreds of small lethal encounters, and it did so relentlessly. The psychological dimension was not incidental. American intelligence noted that the mere presence of Korean forces changed how the enemy behaved in a sector, and captured documents circulated warnings about engaging them. Reputation in a guerrilla war works as a force multiplier. An enemy who declines to fight in your area has been defeated without a shot, and the Tigers understood this better than most. The problem, as the moral record makes plain, is that fear cultivated deliberately does not distinguish between the fighter you mean to deter and the civilian who lives where you have chosen to make an example. The conditions the division faced explain the scale of what it attempted. Binh Dinh province had defied French and South Vietnamese control for 20 years. The terrain ran from a lush coastal plain into foothills and mountains that offered ideal cover for guerrillas. Monsoon seasons turned tracks to mud and grounded aircraft for days, and over the years the Korean tactical area of responsibility expanded from roughly 1,400 square kilometers to more than 3,600, a near tripling of the ground a single division had to hold. By June 1966, the results were undeniable by the standards the war used to measure itself. The Capital Division controlled the entire area north of Quy Nhon, east of Highway 1, up to the base of Phu Cat Mountain, and had extended its grip along Highway 19 toward the An Khe Pass. In their first year, the Tigers claimed more than 3,000 Viet Cong killed and nearly 600 captured, against 290 of their own men dead. They had secured in 8 months a coastal plain that had eluded the French and the Vietnamese for 2 decades. The formal operations record reads as a steady drumbeat. Operation Meng Ho Pheth, a search and destroy sweep through Binh Dinh in late March 1966, produced a Korean claim of 349 Viet Cong killed for the loss of 17. Operation Bun Khe 66-7, run with the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division through the Vinh Thang and Sui Ca valleys, reported 501 enemy dead. Operation O Jak Kyo in the spring of 1967 linked the Tigers zone with that of the newly arrived White Horse Division and yielded a claimed 831 killed and 659 weapons captured against 23 Korean dead. These figures demand caution because the currency of the Vietnam War was the body count, and the body count was a corrupted measure. American commanders knew it distorted more than it revealed. Korean claims, like American ones, were self-reported and hard to verify. The lopsided ratios the Tigers reported were real enough to build a fearsome reputation, but the numbers should be read as the war itself should have been read, which is to say with a skepticism the era often lacked. One engagement shows the method under pressure. During Operation Bun Khe 66-7, the division made contact with a substantial enemy force and, rather than press a frontal assault, deployed 6 companies in an encircling maneuver that trapped the enemy inside a cordon. The Koreans fought through the day and held the ring through the night across successive cycles, compressing the trapped force until it could neither break out nor be resupplied. Run in coordination with the American 1st Cavalry Division's own sweep, the operation produced one of the highest single operation body count claims of the division's early tour. The Tigers did not fight alone. They operated repeatedly alongside the 1st Cavalry Division and the South Vietnamese 22nd Division across Binh Dinh. The largest of these campaigns, the American-led Operation Pershing, ran from February 1967 to January 1968. When the White Horse Division arrived in September 1966, total Korean strength in Vietnam reached roughly 45,000, and the Korean Assistance Group at NHA Trang was upgraded to function as a corps headquarters under General Chae. The South Vietnamese and their foreign allies deserve the same analytical seriousness applied to American forces, and the Korean pacification effort was substantial. The Tigers ran a radio station called Voice of the Tiger, staffed hospital and engineering units, taught physical education to Vietnamese children, and on occasion donated part of their own rice ration to needy villagers. British newsreel footage from 1966 presented the division as a force that had turned a Viet Cong stronghold into one of the most peaceful areas in the country while resettling refugees. That was one face of the Tiger Division, and it was genuine. There was another face, and it took a Korean graduate student and more than 3 decades to bring it fully into the light. Beneath the newsreel image of martial arts demonstrations and refugee aid lay a pattern of violence against civilians that Korean authorities investigated internally and then buried. The reckoning did not come until the year 2000, when reporting in the Korean press, drawing on the research of a graduate student named Koo Soo-jang, forced the subject into public view. The gravest allegations center on the Bin An area of Taeson district in Bin Din in the early weeks of 1966. According to Vietnamese survivors, local officials, and later investigations by authorities in Hanoi, Korean troops entered a cluster of villages they believed to be a Viet Cong stronghold and killed civilians on a large scale over roughly 3 weeks. Estimates of the dead range from just over 1,000 to as many as 1,200, most of them women, children, the elderly, and infants. The killings were reported at the time as enemy killed in action. One incident at a place called Go Dai in late February 1966 reportedly accounted for around 380 of the dead in a single episode. These operations took place under the umbrella of Operation Meng Ho, itself part of the larger Allied Operation Masha. The distinction between combatant and civilian, always contested in this war, appears to have collapsed entirely in these villages. The claims are not fully settled. When the Associated Press investigated in 2000, it reported it could not independently confirm the accounts. Reuters, working the same story, found local officials, including a man who said he had survived, who described the events in detail. A government official in Hanoi stated central authorities had investigated and compiled reports indicating more than 1,000 dead. Bin An was not an isolated allegation. Korean forces across their areas of operation were accused of similar incidents, with names that recur in the literature: Binh Tai, Binh Ho, Ha Mi, and others in Phu Yen, Quang Ngai, and Quang Nam. In 1972, 2 Vietnamese-speaking members of the American Friends Service Committee examined where Korean forces operated in Quang Ngai and Quang Nam, and alleged as many as 45 massacres, including 13 in which more than 20 unarmed civilians were reportedly killed. A separate refugee study for the RAND Corporation documented widespread abuses in Phu Yen province. The pattern in the contemporary reporting is disturbing in its logic. The Time correspondent who covered the Tigers in 1966 recorded rumors that Korean soldiers would wipe out entire hamlets in retaliation for the loss of a single man to a sniper. He recorded as fact an episode in which the mutilated body of a Korean soldier was found in a village suspected of Viet Cong sympathies, after which the Koreans tracked down a captured fighter, skinned him, and hung the body in the village as a warning. Whether such acts were policy or the collapse of discipline under the pressure of a war without a front, the effect was the same. Terror was part of how the reputation was built. The Korean command's response, when it finally came, is part of the story. Interviewed in 2000, General Chae acknowledged that his men had killed civilians. He attributed it to what he called battlefield rage and the uncertainties of war. Korean documents suggest as many as 8,000 Vietnamese civilians may have been killed by Korean troops between 1965 and 1973. Around the same time, President Kim Dae-jung expressed regret for wartime conduct during a state visit to Vietnam, a formulation carefully short of a full apology and a measure of how politically difficult the subject remained in Seoul. There is a paradox buried in the pacification story that the record forces into the open. The methods that made an area quiet and the methods that made it feared were often the same methods. A province becomes peaceful when the guerrillas can no longer operate in it, and the Tigers made Bin Ding quiet in exactly that sense. But quiet purchased through the saturation of a landscape with ambushes, cordons, and deliberate terror is a particular kind of peace. The newsreels showed refugees resettled and children in physical education classes, and those images were true. They were also incomplete, because the same command that donated rice to villagers was in the same months and the same province filing civilian dead under the heading of enemy killed in action. The division stayed in Vietnam far longer than most of the forces it fought beside, remaining until the general withdrawal of Korean troops in the first 3 months of 1973. Its final major engagement came at the Battle of An Khur Pass in April 1972. fought to hold the Highway 19 corridor it had guarded from the beginning. Over nearly 8 years, the Tigers were a fixture of the war in the central provinces, a constant where American units rotated through and departed. For South Korea, the deployment was, in narrow terms, a success. American payments for Korean troops and the contracts that flowed to Korean firms injected hard currency into an economy that badly needed it, and historians of Korea's rapid industrialization count the Vietnam years among its accelerants. The security relationship with Washington deepened. The North was reminded that Seoul now fought abroad, rather than merely surviving at home, and the army came back hardened and professionalized. The reputation the Tigers earned as fierce and capable soldiers was, in the field, thoroughly deserved. Yet that reputation was inseparable from the fear the division deliberately cultivated, and fear of that kind carries costs that appear in no body count. The very autonomy that let the Koreans fight so effectively also insulated them from the scrutiny that might have checked their conduct. The internal investigations that documented civilian deaths were sealed rather than acted upon, and the truth waited 3 decades for a graduate student to uncover it. The methods that secured Bingdeng and the methods that filled the villages of Tay Son with the dead grew from the same root, in the same province, under the same command. For a division that arrived in Vietnam to prove that Korea had come of age, it is a fitting and uncomfortable verdict that the reputation and the reckoning were always 2 faces of the same force.